Okay, so after hours upon hours of research, I finally am ready to make this video. So sit back and strap in because we got a long one today. So it's time to look at every single iteration of the running back position throughout the entirety of NFL history and see how the position has evolved into what it is today. So without further ado, I present to you the evolution of the running back position. Now, in the beginning of the NFL's inception, the running back was by far and away the most important position on the field, with every single play going through the running back. From the first day the NFL was born, running backs started to evolve very quickly, and very soon the running back would begin to form itself into the position that we know today. In the infancy of the NFL, running backs like Jim Thorpe, Dutch Clark, Red Grange, and Bronco Nagurski all showed what the running back position can truly be capable of and set the standard for the position going forward. So this all leads us into the 1940s decade, where we learn more about how the running back began and how players from this era were able to build off of previous running backs and also create new blueprints for players going forward. Now, obviously, the NFL in the 1940s was a completely different league than what we see nowadays, but organizations and players began to test out strategies that are still used to this very day. And the first and most revolutionary concept from this time period was the original $1 million backfield, and the Chicago Cardinals deciding to bring in a loaded backfield by spending more money than any other team in the league at the time. Now, during this time period, the NFL was not the only National Football League, and owners had to outbid other owners in order to get rights to the top players coming out of college. And at the time, Cardinals owner Charles Bidwell wanted to build a contender, and did everything he could to do that, emptying out his pockets to an unprecedented level at this time. Now, Charlie Trippi was the most coveted prospect coming out of college that year, and he wasn't sure which team to go to. Now, the Cardinals made that decision for him pretty easy, as they gave him a $100,000 contract, which was an absurd amount of money back then. So although it was probably completely unintentional, Charlie Trippi had made a significant stride in the evolution of the running back, as he proved that you could make a ton of money by just being a running back on an NFL team. Anyway, now that the Cardinals had armed themselves with 3 great running backs, a fullback, and an amazing quarterback, they were able to go on and win the NFL championship in 1947 with a record of 9-3. And Charles Bidwell's decision to sign Trippi to that incredibly large $100,000 contract was the tipping point in the game, as Charlie Trippi had both a 44-yard run and a 75-yard punt return for touchdowns in the Cardinals' only title win. Yeah, their only title win in 1947. Wow. Now, that backfield was legendary for its time, obviously, and set the standard for how much a running back can really make in the market. But someone who revolutionized the position as a whole in terms of actual skill set and movement was a legendary Eagles player in Steve Van Buren. And this dude was just simply built different. There's no other way to put it. He specialized in just running over dudes. He led the league in rushing yards 4 times and was just an absolute unit of a man. The dude was 6'1", 220 pounds, and in an era like the 1940s, where all the players weren't at the peak of physical athleticism, he was a man amongst boys. Now, Steve Van Buren was really one of the first power backs in the league, and similar to guys like Bronco Nagurski in the past, he helped further bolster the idea that teams needed a dominant power back and an unstoppable run game as a whole in order to win championships. And nobody dominated the 1940s at his position, or even the game of football, like Steve Van Buren. To prove this, at the time of his retirement, Steve Van Buren led the NFL in all-time rushing yards, not a light record to hold at all. Another guy that I think is worth mentioning is Marion Motley, the star fullback for the Cleveland Browns. And Marion Motley was 240 pounds of pure man, and was just bigger than everyone else, similar to Steve Van Buren. Now, what Marion Motley contributed to the back position's evolution was his insane pass protection, as he was a fullback, so that was something he was supposed to specialize in. But when you combine that with his ability to run and catch the ball at a beyond elite level, this made him a unicorn for his time. The dude was so dominant that he even played linebacker for the Browns. I mean, look, he's got 2 career picks. What other fullback can say that? Marion Motley was really just the ultimate team player. Every single year he was on the Browns, they made the championship game, winning 5 titles in the process. And his coach and legendary football figure Paul Brown said that Marion Motley was the best back he ever saw play, and he coached Jim Brown. So from the 1940s, the main takeaway being that the bruising running back style was the most popular popular one in the NFL and the one most sought after by NFL teams. Guys like Marion Motley were able to play the fullback position and bring a little bit of flair and spice to the running back. But that style of running didn't entirely take off until later, so we'll have to see how it changes in the future. So now we move on into the 1950s, where this decade was dominated by one player, and that guy was Jim Brown, who, by the way, played fullback. So Jim Brown, like the guys before him, was 6'2", 230 pounds in an era where some offensive linemen were around that size. He was another guy who was built to just be a bruising running back, but also had the ability to juke guys out of their socks and was just faster than everyone too. And even though it's almost been 60 years since he last played a game, he is still number one in NFL history in yards per game with 104.3, and no other player is even breaking 100 besides him. He also led the league in rushing yards every single year of his career besides 1962, as again, let me remind you, a fullback. But that isn't really a big deal, as a really important distinction with this era is that the leading rushers for the NFL back then were almost always fullbacks rather than running backs. And I know this is a running backs evolution video, but for a while the positions were basically the same, as the fullback position we'd come to know today has been defined as the guy who primarily blocks for the quarterback or plays the lead blocker for the running back. But Jim Brown was not that modern fullback that you've come to know today. Brown became the ideal model player to run an offense through, and became the standard for any running back or fullback going forward. So in a way, Jim Brown was able to take half of what Marion Motley did and about half of what Steve Van Buren did and mix them together with his own elusiveness, creating a new mold of running back for the future. But before we move on, I should mention the two backs that ran with the Colts during the 1950s, Alan Amici and Lenny Moore. Amici was the fullback of the team who was also the power back for this Colts team, as the fullback. Once again, this is just what it was in the 1950s. His nickname was literally the Iron Horse, and he logged about 170 plus carries a year. Not much else to him, he was just your standardized power back, and oh, he also has arguably the most important touchdown in NFL history under his career belt. But the more important player between these two is Lenny Moore, because he was absolutely crucial to the game's evolution. Not only did he reinvent the position by being arguably the best back in the league as a rookie, he was also an incredible receiver being used at the flanker position, which meant that he lined up off the ball as a receiver. The position was able to completely unleash Lenny Moore and put his receiving skills as a back on full display, as he racked up 6,039 career receiving yards to pair with his 5,174 rushing yards. Moore was the first real mold of a true receiving back, and almost single-handedly added an irreplaceable cornerstone to the modern NFL back. This style of play that Lenny brought paved the way for future players like LaDainian Tomlinson, Roger Craig, Marshall Faulk, and more recently Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara to specialize in receiving and rushing dominance as a back. But with that being said, what this era of football also contributed to the evolution of the running back is the intangibles, like fans' perception of the position. Massive stars like Frank Gifford took advantage of his huge market in New York to make himself a household name, and in a way, shape the running back and or fullback into the most beloved player on each team. Now, because the running back was still the overall flashiest player on the football field, the casual NFL fan still knew who each team's running back was, and these players took full advantage of that, something that would be exploited even further on into the game's history. So now we move on into the 1960s, where for the first time, things began to shake up a bit. Vince Lombardi's Packers used a similar strategy to those 1950 Colts teams, as he utilized a backfield of fullback Jim Taylor and running back Paul Hornung, as well as iconic Packer plays like the Packer sweep. But as great as those Packers teams were, and that double running duo, a majority of the running back's evolution came from someone that actually wasn't a fullback for once, and the person I'm talking about is this guy, Gale Sayers. Throughout the 1960s, besides Jim Brown, who was still going strong, Gale Sayers was the most productive running back in the league, and it could be argued he was the overall best. Like all all-time greats from that era, he came in as a rookie and lit the league on fire, as he still has the most touchdowns by a rookie running back ever with 22 on the year. Gale Sayers was just absolutely incredible. The NFL had never seen anyone like him, and he was just oozing talent from up to down. During his prime, Gale Sayers was able to rack up multiple 100 100-yard seasons a year, and was also pretty easily the best return man of his era and one of the best of all time. If you can't understand how great this guy was from just his highlights alone, know that he only played 64 games in his entire career, and he was a no-brainer first ballot Hall of Famer. For reference, that would be like if halfway through this upcoming season, Nick Chubb just retired and was immediately considered a first ballot Hall of Famer. That's how short Gale Sayers' career truly was, but regardless, the mark he left on the game of football was a monumentous one. Now, what Gale Sayers did contribute in terms of evolution is display the potential an overwhelmingly talented running back could have in the league if healthy, and that the current mold of a standardized back could be pushed so far outside the current mold. Anyway, also like I said before, Gale Sayers' career was cut tragically short. When doctors were doing surgery on Sayers' knee, they found it had been completely mangled, and there were sews and staples in there to try to create stability in the knee to try to get him to play even more football. At the time of his retirement, there was literally zero cartilage left in his knee, which meant in his final season, he had played with his joints rubbing together for the whole year, and thus robbing us of a long career of Gale Sayers. And also just something I thought I'd throw in there, but Gale Sayers never played in a playoff game, so it really just shows that a running back, no matter how great they are, can only do so much for a team. And now we move on into the 1970s, where running backs became more defined and niche into fulfilling one specific role. And no running back describes that idea better than Earl Campbell and his disgustingly bruising style of running the football. Earl Campbell absolutely perfected the mold of the punishing running back position started by guys like Steve Van Buren. He was an absolute massive human who always wanted more contact and always seemed to fall forward when he was hit too. He had insane speed for a guy his size, as he had 36-inch thighs, was 5'11", and 250. He led the league in rushing yards and yards per game from 1978 through 1980, so for 3 straight years, he was the best pure runner in the league. Oh, and also, those were his first 3 years in the league! And he also led the league in touchdowns for 2 of those years. And just for fun, he ended up winning MVP of the league in his second year when he ran for damn near 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns on an 11-5 Oilers team. The man was just not human. At that size, he was faster than your fastest linebacker, stronger than your strongest D lineman, and wanted blood from everyone. To try and rationalize him in modern terms, he was like a fast Marshawn Lynch with the thighs and brute strength of a guy like A.J. Dillon or Derrick Henry. But unfortunately, a common denominator with the hard-nosed running back style would be severe health problems. As similar to Gale Sayers, he really only played about 6 years in the league in his prime, and had to retire very quickly after that, and was out of the league after a short but memorable couple of years of dominance at the running back position. More players like Larry Zonka and John Riggins, to me, encapsulated what I believe to be the golden era of the bruising running back position in the NFL. Also, if you somehow haven't noticed yet, all running backs from this era and previous ones were taught to lead with their head, something that would obviously be changed in the future, but it's going to be interesting to see how the running styles of leading with your head will slowly be eradicated as we go on by looking at each decade. Anyways, it needs to be said that during this time, some running backs did break free of the norm at the time and became more elusive, skill-reliant backs. So this is O.J. Simpson. Alright, no O.J. jokes this time. I'm going to be completely serious. O.J. Simpson killed his wife. Anyways, O.J. Simpson was nothing short of a cold-blooded killer in the field and was one of the first running backs to show how far you could go relying on mainly talent. And although nowadays O.J. Simpson is more well known for just being a nice guy all around and someone you'd love to hang out with, but in his prime, he had one of, if not the best seasons a running back has ever had in 1973. And in that year, he ran for 2,000 yards in only 14 games, averaging 143 yards per game, winning the MVP. In terms of evolution to the running back position, OJ showed how a guy can use the open field and break away from defenders rather than running them over like guys before him such as Earl Campbell. He showed that although bruising running backs still could flourish in the NFL, a running back with his style of play, such as elusiveness, could also be just as viable. OJ also brought in unmatched competitiveness, will to win, and just an overall killer instinct. Really great guy. Just glad to see him doing well today. Anyways, there is one more running back that I thought I'd mention from this decade. Walter Payton. He's he's pretty good. You may have heard of him. All Walter Payton did was take Jim Brown's model for a running back and kicked him to the side, becoming the new standard for running backs across the league. Walter Payton is the closest thing we've ever seen to a perfect build of a running back. And although he had so many skills, I think the most impressive one in his entire career was his durability, which just so happens to be something that every single running back that we discussed previously had struggled immensely with almost none of them surpassing even 7 seasons in the NFL. But all Walter Payton did in terms of durability was miss one game in his entire 13-year career. So the main ingredient that Walter Payton added to the running back position was proving that in order to have a long career as a running back, you need to be nothing short of a technician when it comes to shooting holes and taking care of your body. Walter was impressively good at taking care of himself, especially for his era, and didn't just aimlessly charge at guys whenever he felt like it, but he only did so when it was completely necessary, and he was still pretty good at that too. But like I said before, Walter Payton did absolutely everything. He blocked better than anyone. He also ran better and received better than any running back that had ever played the game, proving in order to stay on the field as a running back in the league going forward, you needed to be versatile at the very least, or else you would just never survive. And to prove his versatility even further, Walter Payton still to this day has the most receptions in Bears history. I know that stat may not sound like much, but as a running back, Walter Payton has led the second oldest team in NFL history in receptions as a running back. The man had zero flaws in his game. Well, besides fumbles. He wasn't great at ball security, but whatever. So we go into the 1980s, where Walter Payton also continued to dominate, along with other newcomer Eric Dickerson. Dickerson has got to be one of the most interesting and disrespected running backs in NFL history. Now, Dickerson, compared to a guy like Walter Payton, was able to be a technician, finding holes and using his footwork to his advantage, separating himself from other running backs of his era. Dickerson was more of a product of the groundwork that was laid out before him, as he was able to take the technician style of Walter Payton and use it with a hefty workload of a guy like Earl Campbell. So because he was able to use his speed to kick to the outside and avoid a lot of contact, he was able to take a ton of carries per year and took a lot longer to break down compared to running backs in the past. I mean, in his first 4 seasons, 3 out of the 4 years, he ran for at least 1,800 yards. That is absolutely inhuman. Anyway, as absurdly talented running backs like Eric Dickerson and Marcus Allen were continuing to refine the running back position from guys before them, other players during this era were continuing to push the evolution of the back position forward. But there hasn't been a fullback that has taken this heavy of a workload in an offense since he played, and the guy I'm talking about is Christian Okoye, the Nigerian Nightmare. So Christian Okoye was a 6'1", 240-pound fullback who led the league in rushing yards in 1989. The first guy to do that at that position all the way back since Jim Brown in 1965. Now, similarly to guys like Earl Campbell before him, Christian Okoye thrived off of a bruising running back playstyle. And also similar to those guys, he only played 6 years in the league, except this was more due to the fact that he came into the NFL at the age of 26, instead of the injuries that guys like Earl Campbell and Gale Sayers suffered. So although Christian Okoye was able to briefly bring the fullback back from the dead, he was also able to use his raw talent and just size like guys in the past had to overwhelm players and just straight up run them over. So as you can tell by pretty much all of these players, the apple never falls too far from the tree. All running backs have some quality that a past running back has had, and they all build off of each other's molds and become better players because of each other. So now with that, we move on into the 1990s, which to me have got to be the golden age of running backs, with so many talented guys like Jerome Bettis, Thurman Thomas, Terrell Davis, and Emmitt Smith. But ultimately I decided to narrow down the entire 1990s decade into 2 players in specific, those being Barry Sanders and Marshall Faulk. So Marshall Faulk, a guy who admittedly primarily did most of his career damage in the late 90s and early 2000s, however, he was still an absolute buzzsaw in the early 90s. Marshall Faulk took that Roger Craig, Lenny Moore style of pass catching back and elevated it into becoming the cornerstone of an offensive juggernaut. You could argue that Marshall Faulk had a 3-year stretch better than any other running back in the history of the game. From 1999 to 2001, Marshall Faulk made 3 first-team All-Pros, made 3 Pro Bowls, a Super Bowl championship, rushed for 4,122 yards at 5.4 yards per carry, recorded 251 receptions for 2,643 yards as a running back, might I remind you, and because he just felt like it, he had 37 rushing touchdowns to go along with 22 receiving touchdowns, was named the Offensive Player of the Year for 3 straight years, and won the 2000 MVP. And like I mentioned before, guys like Terrell Davis also had insane small stretches of time. And overall, I think the 90s really just showed how high a running back can possibly peak as a player, while also keeping an insanely valuable spot on any offense. But one guy really took that hero ball style of offense to a whole nother level, and that man was Barry Sanders. Barry Sanders is nothing short of an NFL legend, and I don't think anything else has to be said. But just in case you don't know enough about Barry Sanders, he ran for 2,000 yards in 14 games. Only Emmitt Smith and Walter Payton have more yards than him. He was a Pro Bowler every single season of his career, and he still tragically retired early at the age of 31, a season removed from rushing for 2,000 yards. And at the time of his retirement, he was only 500 yards away from the all-time rushing record. Barry Sanders contributed so much to evolution. He still used that insane talent of his to separate himself from his peers, but what also separated him was his intangibles. His personality was not comparable to anyone of that era. Barry Sanders would humiliate your defense, butchering them in every way possible, would score the most absurd touchdown you'd ever seen with your 2 eyes, and then would just hand the ball off to the ref and trot to the sideline like nothing had happened. And to drop one more ingredient into this running back pot that has been stewing over the past 50 years, he was also able to show that smaller guys could have a dominant place in the running back hierarchy. At 5'8", 200 pounds, Barry Sanders had the exact same build as someone like Danny Woodhead, and it's safe to say those two were, a little bit different as players, but because of his size, Barry Sanders was able to utilize his incredibly low center of gravity to almost get underneath defenders, all while keeping his balance perfectly to catch people off guard with a quick juke. So yeah, Barry Sanders was able to absolutely revolutionize the running back position, and it's fair to say to most people that he is still considered the best running back in NFL history. Anyway, we move on into the 2000s, which is arguably the last decade in which the running back was perceived as valuable as it was. Dominant running backs like Edgerrin James and Shaun Alexander were able to dominate their offenses and become cornerstones of their supposed Super Bowl contending teams. But each decade has that one player that pushes the evolution of the position further than anyone else, and this decade's is LaDainian Tomlinson. He was a very similar player to Barry Sanders, but also had that flair of Roger Craig / Lenny Moore to him, and he was able to catch passes better than any running back ever. LaDainian Tomlinson really just had it all. He was a flawless runner, a great pass protector, and was by far and away the greatest receiving back in the history of the NFL, something that would become even more popular as time went on. He had 7 straight 1,000-yard seasons and 10 touchdowns on each of those years. He has the most rushing touchdowns in a single year, won the 2006 MVP, and in that span had 5 Pro Bowls and 4 All-Pro selections. We now move into the 2010s, where the running back went through its most drastic change. The 2010s had great running backs, with guys like Frank Gore, LaShawn McCoy, and Jamal Charles, and above all of them, Adrian Peterson. And Adrian Peterson, obviously, was absolutely insane in his prime. Adrian Peterson, to this day, is still the last running back to win the MVP, and he rightfully deserved that in that monstrous 2,000-yard 2012 season. But in terms of evolution, Adrian Peterson really just refined that Gale Sayers, O.J. Simpson style of runner. But I think the most important detail from this decade has got to be the death of the fullback. Now, I didn't mention it for a reason, but in the 2000s, a guy like Mike Allstott was really the last fullback to take consistent carries on an offense, and in the 2010s, that was almost completely unheard of. Before the 2010s, it was a staple of every single offense to have 1 or even 2 fullbacks on a roster, but in this decade, it wasn't uncommon to see a fullback just straight up not on a team. So people like Marion Motley, Jim Brown, and Christian Okoye weren't completely extinct. Instead, they were just used as running backs, making the fullback position almost completely useless. was. So now in the 2020s, we have seen the running back position completely mastered by several different running backs. The name of the modern game has been efficiency, and the old style runners like Earl Campbell and Gale Sayers have been completely cut out of the league. You now have the best bruisers in the NFL like Derrick Henry, who can run over anyone anytime he wants, but often chooses to stick to the hash marks and tries to outrun his defenders at his massive 6'3", 240-pound frame. You also have that O.J. Simpson, Gale Sayers athletic freak like Saquon Barkley or Najee Harris, people who are able to use their talent to their advantage and just straight up out-skill and out-talent their opponents. Then you got your muscle bowling balls like Dalvin Cook and Nick Chubb, and your receiving prototypes of LaDainian Tomlinson like Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey, all of which have mastered the previous running back positions. So from guys like Steve Van Buren, Earl Campbell, Walter Payton, Barry Sanders, LaDainian Tomlinson, and now currently Derrick Henry, the running back position has gone through a full wheel of changes, each guy from a new decade adding a simple ingredient to make up the modern running back. But if you enjoyed this video, then please like and comment. It helps in the algorithm a ton, and if you enjoyed this video, then watch this video right here as I break down who the biggest draft bust in NFL history is. You'll love it, trust me. Anyways, until next time.